As in any armed conflict, the Second World War was marked by certain pivotal moments that would prove crucial in determining its final outcome. Some of the episodes that marked a turning point in its development are well known. Among them, one can cite the Battle of Britain, July 10 to October 31, 1940, in which the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, RAF, stoically withstood the attacks of the German Luftwaffe. Winston Churchill would later utter one of his most famous phrases about them: "Never was so much indebted to so many to so few." Another example is the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which led to the United States entering the war, or, on the European continent, the so-called Operation Barbarossa, June 22 to December 5, 1941, by which Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening a new front that would later divide its forces and become impossible to defend. Another of these battles, and to be more specific, one of the fiercest battles that took place in World War II, was the struggle that Americans and Japanese maintained for a piece of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the battle for a small islet called Iwo Jima, a hell in the Pacific. Iwo Jima, which translates from Japanese as Sulphur Island, is a small island of only about 20 square kilometers located halfway between Japan and the Mariana Archipelago. Iwo Jima was an essential strategic enclave for both armies. Despite its strategic location, about 1,200 kilometers from Tokyo, the island of Iwo Jima didn't have much to offer in terms of practical resources. True to its name, it was literally a pestilent volcanic islet from which periodic emissions of sulfurous vapors emanated. To the detriment of the Americans and to the advantage of the Japanese soldiers, the island's terrain was markedly rugged, the vegetation sparse, and the availability of fresh water was one of its greatest challenges. On its southern slope, the island is dominated by a 168-meter-high hill, Mount Suribachi. It was here that the Japanese would establish their last stronghold of resistance against the United States forces and where a fierce guerrilla war would be waged for more than a month. 2 palms space of land. To understand the importance of Iwo Jima for both armies, seemingly a barren and insignificant island, and the reasons that motivated the bloody episode that took place there, we must delve into the circumstances that both sides were dealing with at that time. A few months before the dispute over the coveted island began, between October 23 and 26, 1944, one of the largest naval battles in history took place, the Battle of Leyte, also known as the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. Its outcome resulted in a major naval defeat for the Empire of Japan in the Pacific, leaving its naval force virtually incapacitated. Unable to confront the Allies at sea, Japanese strategy became an extreme exercise in resistance for each of the islands still under its control. It was at this time that the Japanese realized that the war was practically lost, so being intransigent in the face of future American offensives seemed the only way to reach a peace agreement that, at least in the political aspect, respected the divine institutional status of the emperor. On the opposing side, the situation would improve. With the Marianas conquered by the Americans, its islands would serve as a strategic enclave for establishing air bases from which fighters and bombers would launch attacks on major Japanese cities, paving the way for the total conquest of the Pacific. With the Japanese naval force out of action, everything seemed to be going the Allies' way. However, they still had to face one last logistical hurdle, which made control of the islet an absolute necessity. At that time, the crown jewels of the U.S. Air Force were the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, B-29, a 4-engine propeller-driven heavy bomber, and the North American P-51 Mustang, P-51, a long-range, single-engine fighter bomber that first entered service during World War II. The B-29S had ample range to cover some 6,000 kilometers without refueling, giving them sufficient capability to complete the round trip from the Marianas. In contrast, the fast and modern P-51S only had a range of about 1,500 kilometers, insufficient to escort the bombers to Japan. Without the escort of the P-51S, the American bombers were an easy target. In addition, the Japanese had several airfields on the island, as well as a radar installation. This radar would sound the alarm when B-29S were heading towards Japan, alerting Japanese fighters who, without the escort of P-51S, found it easy to shoot down the bombers. Iwo Jima would therefore become the Americans' primary short-term objective. And the Japanese knew it. Operation Detachment and the Pillbox. The Battle of Iwo Jima took place between February 19 and March 26, 1945. In it, Americans and Japanese would put their respective combat strategies into action. The island would defend itself with the life of every last soldier. Under the premise of selling the lives of each of the imperial soldiers for the highest possible price, the Japanese defense of the island fell into the hands of General Tadamichi Kurabayashi. This force would have about 21,000 soldiers, very few compared to the approximately 250,000 men that would make up the squadron sent by the Allies. However, the Japanese were on home turf, and the terrain was in their favor. Thus, the strategy developed by the Japanese general became known as the Pillbox. Concentrating their efforts on Mount Suribachi, the ruse consisted of constructing a series of tunnels distributed and connected throughout the island, which, reinforced by numerous bunkers, traps, and fortifications, allowed the Japanese to fire and change positions quickly. In the Japanese mindset, there was no room for surrender. The island would be defended with the life of every last soldier. The idea was to force the enemy to penetrate the network devised by Kurabayashi. And here, the Japanese fighters would pay a heavy price for their lives, defending every cave, every bunker, every inch of ground, even with kamikaze tactics, sometimes fighting at gunpoint, other times, detonating their own grenades. All of this was not foreseen by the Americans, who, in the operation dubbed Detachment Isolation in its Spanish translation and already under the command of General Holland Smith, planned to seize control of the island within a maximum of 10 days. Once again, theory and practice failed to align. A maritime siege. Operation Detachment began on February 19, 1945, however, the landing of American troops on the island was preceded by a series of preparations. Thus, days before the attack, the U.S. Navy proceeded to blockade the island with submarines to prevent supplies from reaching the defenders. Also, during the 3 days prior to the assault, intense waves of bombardment ensued, first from battleships and later from aircraft arriving from the Marianas, which used napalm in addition to bombs. Of these attacks, Admiral Chester William Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, would say no other island like Iwo Jima had ever before received such a preliminary bombardment. No other island like Iwo Jima had ever received such a preliminary bombardment. Everything seemed ready for the soldiers' arrival. However, once ashore, their advance was slow and uneven, as the Japanese exploited every corner of the island to their advantage. While the Americans had to advance blindly, the defenders, on the other hand, had the advantage of being connected to the rest of their forces through the island's underground tunnels. In fact, these fortifications, along with pillboxes and bunkers, were designed so that there were no blind spots between the various defensive positions, ensuring that any position under attack could be defended with the help of neighboring posts. The apparent advance of the American troops was repeatedly repelled by Japanese soldiers, who emerged from their hidden positions, waiting for the opportunity, attacking them from the rear, and forcing them to retrace the ground they had gained. Despite the resistance offered, it was, from the outset, a lost battle for the Japanese, one that dragged on for another 34 grim days for both sides. With everything lost by the Japanese, the fighting culminated on March 25, 1945, in a final banzai attack led by General Korebayashi. A day later, the U.S. Military High Command declared the island under its definitive control. At its conclusion, for the first time during the entire war, American casualties outnumbered Japanese. The conflict resulted in 24,480 American deaths compared to 20,703 Japanese casualties. After Iwo Jima, the question remained of how much longer the Japanese could resist, and what the cost in lives would be for the Allies in a war that, though practically won, could still drag on indefinitely. Thus, the staunch Japanese resistance would be one of the arguments that tipped the scales. In August of that same year, toward the use of atomic weapons against the empire of the rising Sunday. Iwo Jima was a bloodbath, but the worst was yet to come.